The gale outside was screaming, a physical force tearing at the iron shutters of the lantern room. But the only sound that actually registered in my brain was the ragged, wet hitch of Sophia's breath against the sensitive skin of my neck. I had been warned about the cold. Everyone in town had told me the lighthouse was a freezing, isolated hell, and that the woman guarding it was made of the same unyielding ice as the Atlantic swell crashing 70 feet below us. They were wrong. The danger wasn't the temperature. It was the suffocating, molten heat radiating from her body, the way the air in the cramped space had thickened into something electric and heavy. I couldn't feel the draft anymore. I could only feel the crushing weight of her hand burning through the damp cotton of my shirt, her fingers digging into the curve of my waist with a possession that was terrifying, absolute, and undeniably desperate. To understand how I ended up trapped against a lighthouse mechanism with a woman who looked ready to devour me, you have to understand the silence of the town where it started. I arrived in Oak Haven on a Tuesday, stepping off the ferry into a world that seemed to be painted entirely in shades of slate and bruised purple. The air didn't just smell of salt, it tasted of brine and diesel, a thick coating sensation that settled in the back of your throat instantly. It was a place where people spoke in short, clipped sentences, hoarding their words like they hoarded warmth against the damp. But even in a town defined by its reticence, the whispers about Sophia were loud. They didn't call her by her name at first. They called her the captain's daughter, or the keeper, or simply her. The locals at the pub, a dark-paneled place that smelled of yeast and old rain, warned me with a kind of grim satisfaction. They told me she ran the harbor logistics with an iron fist, that she had inherited her father's boat and his temper, but none of his humor. "She's cold," the bartender had told me, wiping a glass with a rag that had seen better days. Not mean exactly, just absent. Like she's looking through you to check the tide charts on the wall behind your head. I didn't believe them. Or rather, I didn't care. I needed passage to the lighthouse to document the old Fresnel lens for the archives, and Sophia was the only one with a boat sturdy enough to handle the chop. I first saw her down at the commercial quay. It was early, the sun struggling to break through the persistent coastal fog, turning the harbor into a blurred, dreamlike scene. She was hauling crates of iced mackerel from the deck of the Grayling to the loading truck. I stopped dead at the edge of the pier. It wasn't just that she was beautiful, though she was, in a sharp, devastating way that made my breath catch. It was the kinetic efficiency of her movement. She didn't move like someone who was tired. She moved like a machine calibrated for this exact environment. I watched, mesmerized, as she gripped a heavy crate. She wore a thick woolen sweater with the sleeves pushed up, revealing forearms corded with muscle. I saw the tendons flex, the veins standing out against her skin as she swung the load with a terrifying, casual strength. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation, just a fluid, powerful rhythm that felt almost hypnotic to watch. She wiped her forehead with the back of a gloved hand, leaving a smudge of grease on her temple, and I felt a sudden, sharp pull in my chest that had nothing to do with professional curiosity. I walked down the gangway, the wood slick under my boots. The gulls were screaming overhead, diving for scraps, but the noise faded as I got closer to her. "Sophia?" I asked. She stopped. She didn't jump or startle, she just went perfectly still, then turned slowly to face me. Her eyes were the color of the sea during a squall, dark, churning, and utterly unimpressed. "You're the archivist," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was lower than I expected, a rough, textured sound that vibrated in the air between us. "I need a ride to the light," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the way she was dissecting me with that gaze. "I was told you're the best pilot in the harbor." She laughed, a short, dry sound that had zero humor in it. I'm the only pilot who isn't drunk by noon or scared of the swell, she corrected, crossing her arms over her chest. The posture should have been defensive, but on her, it looked like a challenge. And the answer is no. The glass is dropping. Storm's coming in. I'm not risking the grayling for some pictures of a light bulb. She turned back to her nets, dismissing me with a curt, professional finality that bordered on rude. But I didn't leave. I stood there, watching her hands work the knots with blinding speed, fascinated by the dexterity of her fingers, the rough, capable grace of them. Standing there, breathing in the scent of diesel and the ozone of the approaching storm, I didn't see the coldness they warned me about. I saw tension. I saw a woman coiled tight, holding herself back with a discipline that was exhausting to witness. And for the first time in my life, I didn't want to retreat to safety. I wanted to see what happened if that control snapped. I didn't sleep well that night. The local inn had thin walls and a radiator that clanked like a dying engine. But mostly, I was kept awake by the memory of Sophia's eyes. The way she had looked at me, dismissive, yes, but with a flicker of something else underneath the irritation. A challenge. I found her the next morning at the end of the pier. The fog was thicker today, a wet, heavy blanket that muffled the sound of the ocean against the pilings. She was sitting on an overturned crate, a pile of tangled green netting spilled across her lap like a chaotic sea creature she was dissecting. I stopped 10 feet away, just watching. Her hands were moving with a speed that blurred the edges of her fingers. She held a plastic shuttle in one hand, weaving it through the mesh with a rhythm that was aggressive, almost violent in its precision. Snap, pull, twist. Snap, pull, twist. It was mesmerizing. I found myself fixated on the dexterity of her fingers, long, calloused, scarred in a dozen places from hooks and lines. These weren't soft hands. They were tools, weathered by salt and labor, capable of tying knots that could hold against a gale or, I imagined, crushing something fragile if she wasn't careful. The thought sent a jolt of heat straight to my stomach that had no business being there at 7 a.m. in the freezing mist. "You're staring," she said without looking up. Her voice was rougher this morning, like she'd spent the night shouting at the wind. "I'm observing," I corrected, stepping closer. The smell of her was stronger here, old wool, coffee, and that sharp, metallic scent of the sea. "The weather report says the window is closing. If we don't go now, I'm stuck here for a week." She finally looked up. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, strands escaping to stick to her damp neck. "I told you no." "I thought it was because of the danger," I lied smoothly, leaning against a pylon. "But maybe the rumors were wrong. Maybe the grayling isn't as steady as they say. Or maybe the pilot just doesn't have the stomach for the swell today." It was a cheap shot, childish even, but it hit the mark. Sophia's jaw tightened. I watched a muscle feather in her cheek, a tiny spasm of annoyance that fascinated me. She stood up slowly, the netting sliding from her lap with a hiss. She was taller than me, broad-shouldered in that heavy sweater, and when she stepped into my personal space, the air suddenly felt very thin. "Get your gear," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "If you puke on my deck, you're swimming back." The victory felt precarious, like standing on a cliff edge. I grabbed my bag and followed her to the ladder. The tide was low, meaning we had to climb down to the grayling. She went first, dropping onto the swaying deck with the grace of a cat. I followed, but as my boot hit the gunwale, the boat lurched violently on a rogue swell. I stumbled, my center of gravity lost. I reached out blindly, and then impact. Her hand shot out, catching me by the waist. It wasn't a tentative, steadying grip. It was a clamp. Her fingers dug into the soft curve of my side through my coat, pulling me upright with a force that knocked the breath out of me. For a second, just one heartbeat, we were pressed together. My chest bumped against hers, and I felt the solid, unyielding wall of her body. The heat radiating from her was shocking, cutting through the layers of wool and Gore-Tex like a brand. I looked up, startled, and found her face inches from mine. Her pupils were blown wide, black swallowing the stormy gray. She didn't let go immediately. Her hand stayed on my waist, her thumb pressing hard against my hip bone, anchoring me. I could feel the individual pads of her fingers, the strength in them, the absolute control she had over my balance. My breath hitched, a traitorous, audible sound in the quiet morning. "Watch your step," she murmured. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, lingered for a fraction of a second, heavy, dark, hungry, before snapping back to my eyes. My pulse jumped in my throat, a frantic, visible flutter against the collar of my shirt. Then she released me, the loss of her touch leaving a cold spot on my side that burned. She turned away abruptly, marching to the wheelhouse without a backward glance. "Cast off the stern line," she shouted over her shoulder, her voice tight. I fumbled with the rope, my hands shaking slightly. I told myself it was the cold. I told myself it was the adrenaline of the trip. But as the engine roared to life beneath our feet, a deep, guttural thrum that vibrated up through the soles of my boots and settled between my thighs, I knew I was lying. We pulled away from a dock, the grayling cutting through the gray water with a powerful surge. I stood near the cabin door, watching her through the glass. She stood with her legs braced apart, riding the sway of the boat like she was part of the hull. Her hands were on the wheel, 10 and 2, knuckles white, then relaxing, then tightening again as she fought the current. I couldn't look away from those hands. I kept remembering the pressure of them on my waist, the phantom weight of her thumb digging in. The silence on the boat wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with the roar of the engine and the unspoken memory of that moment on the deck. The town faded into the mist behind us, swallowed by the gray, until it was just the two of us, the rolling ocean, and the dangerous, vibrating tension of being alone with a woman who could steady me or wreck me with a single touch. The harbor was a lie. Out here, the Atlantic was awake and angry. The grayling wasn't gliding anymore. It was punching through walls of water. The transition was violent. 1 minute we were chugging through the soup of the bay, and the next, the seafloor seemed to drop away, leaving us suspended over a churning, dark abyss. The boat, which had felt so substantial at the dock, suddenly felt like a toy in a washing machine. The waves weren't just rolling, they were standing up. Gray walls of water that smashed against the hull with a sound like a sledgehammer hitting a steel drum. I was clinging to the brass handrail inside the wheelhouse, my body tense, trying to anticipate the rhythm of the ocean. But there was no rhythm. It was chaotic, a violent, syncopated beat of rise, crash, and stomach-churning drop. Rain lashed against the plexiglass, distorting the world into smears of gray and white foam. Sophia, however, hadn't flinched. She stood at the wheel, legs spread wide for balance, her body swaying in perfect counterpoint to the boat's heave. She wasn't fighting the ocean. She was dancing with it, a rough, aggressive tango that required total focus. I watched the muscles in her back shift under her damp sweater, the way her shoulders locked when the wheel fought her grip. Then, the bottom fell out. We crested a massive swell, hanging weightless for a terrifying second, before slamming down into the trough. My boots lost traction on the slick metal floor. I flailed, sliding inevitably toward the open side of the cabin, toward the freezing spray and the gunnel. I didn't even have time to shout. Sophia moved faster than thought. She didn't let go of the wheel with her left hand, but her right arm shot out like a piston. Her hand slammed into my upper arm, her fingers curling around my bicep with a grip that was shocking in its intensity. It wasn't a gentle assist. It was a clamp of pure, unadulterated strength. She yanked me back toward the center of the cabin, the force of it pulling a gasp from my throat. She didn't let go once I was steady. She held me there, pinned in place by her grip, her fingers digging deep into the muscle. I could feel the heat of her palm burning through my coat, a searing point of contact in the freezing cold. "I told you!" she shouted over the roar of the engine and the wind. Her voice wasn't high or panicked. It was deep, resonant, a command that vibrated straight through my ribcage. "Don't fight the roll. Move with it." I looked up at her, breathless, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. She wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were locked on the next wave, scanning the water with a predator's intensity. But she didn't release my arm. If anything, her grip tightened, her thumb pressing into the sensitive hollow of my inner arm, a possessive, grounding weight that made my knees weak. A wave smashed over the bow, sending a sheet of freezing spray whipping into the cabin. It soaked us instantly. Water streamed down Sophia's face, plastering her hair to her forehead, darkening the heavy wool of her sweater until it clung to her shoulders. The water stripped away the composed professional I had met on the dock. What was left was something raw, elemental. Her skin was flushed with adrenaline and cold, a vein in her temple throbbing in time with the engine's roar. She looked wild, dangerous. She turned her head then, finally looking at me. Water dripped from her jaw. She was checking for panic. She was looking for the fear she expected to see in the eyes of an outsider. I didn't give it to her. I held her gaze, fighting the tremor in my legs, feeling the bruise blooming under her fingers on my arm. I didn't pull away. I leaned into her grip, silently acknowledging the transfer of power. Something shifted in her eyes. The dark, churning gray softened, just a fraction. The corner of her mouth quirked up, not a smile, but a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of approval. She squeezed my arm once, a deliberate, pulsing pressure that sent a shiver racing down my spine, and then finally, slowly, released me. "There," she said, her voice dropping to a lower, rougher register that seemed to scrape against my nerves. She pointed a wet, gloved hand forward. I followed her gesture. Through the curtain of rain and fog, a shadow emerged. It was darker than the storm, a towering monolith of black stone rising out of the churning white foam. The lighthouse. And as we plunged toward it, I realized with a sudden, terrifying clarity that I wasn't just trapped by the storm. I was trapped with her. Docking at the Needle was an exercise in calculated violence. The lighthouse didn't sit on a beach. It erupted from a jagged spine of black basalt that the Atlantic seemed determined to swallow whole. There was no harbor, no breakwater, just a concrete slipway that disappeared under the foaming surf every 6 seconds. Sophia navigated the grayling toward the rocks with a terrifying kind of confidence, timing the surge of the ocean with the throttle. The engine roared in reverse, the water churned white, and for a heart-stopping moment, we hovered inches from the concrete wall as the ocean tried to smash the hull into splinters. "Jump!" Her command was a bark, sharp and undisputed. I threw my bag onto the wet concrete and scrambled over the gunnel, my boots slipping on the slime-coated stone. I landed hard, my knees jarring, and spun around just in time to see Sophia leap. She moved with a heavy, fluid power, holding the stern line in one coil. She hit the ground and immediately wrapped the rope around a rusted iron cleat, her muscles straining against the pull of the retreating wave. The boat bucked like a wild animal on a leash, but she held it. She hauled the line tight, her jaw set, her entire body angled against the force of the sea, until the grayling was secure. She didn't look at me. She just grabbed her pack and jerked her head toward the stairs. "Move, the wind is picking up." The climb was a nightmare. A narrow, rusted iron staircase wound its way up the sheer face of the cliff, exposed to the full fury of the gale. The wind here wasn't just noise. It was a physical weight, a hand pressing against my chest, trying to peel me off the metal and fling me into the churning water below. Salt spray lashed at my face, stinging like hail. I kept my head down, gripping the freezing rail until my knuckles ached, focusing entirely on the boots moving steadily ahead of me. Sophia didn't falter. She climbed with a rhythmic, relentless drive, her body cutting through the wind while I struggled to keep my footing. By the time we reached the heavy steel door at the base of the tower, I was gasping for air, my lungs burning with the cold. Sophia wrestled the latch open, a massive, complex mechanism of iron and brass, and shoved the door inward against the pressure of the wind. She grabbed my coat collar, hauling me over the threshold with a strength that felt less like assistance and more like a claim, before slamming the door shut behind us. The silence was instantaneous and shocking. The roar of the ocean, the screaming wind, the crash of the waves. It was all severed the moment the latch clicked home. We were left in a sudden, ringing quiet that felt heavy, pressurized, like the air inside a diving bell. The space was utilitarian and stark, a circular vestibule of whitewashed stone and iron grating. It smelled intense, a thick, heady mixture of kerosene, old stone, damp wool, and the metallic tang of ozone. It was the smell of isolation. We stood there for a long moment, just breathing. The sound of blood rushing in my ears was loud in the confined space, a deafening thrum as our bodies tried to regulate after the adrenaline of the climb. Water dripped from our coats, forming dark, spreading pools on the concrete floor. I looked at her. Sophia was leaning back against the heavy door, her chest rising and falling in a deep, slow rhythm. Her hair was plastered to her skull, dark with rain, and water ran down the sharp line of her jaw, tracking over the exposed skin of her throat before disappearing into the collar of her sweater. She wiped her face with one hand, slicking the wet hair back, and her eyes met mine. In the boat, there had been the distraction of the sea. Here, in the dim, yellow light of the vestibule, there was nothing but us. The space felt incredibly small. The stone walls seemed to press in, trapping the heat of our bodies and the tension of the journey. The storm was raging just inches away, on the other side of that steel plate, but we were sealed in. There was no boat back. There was no walking away. "We're locked in," she said, her voice low, the rough timbre of it seeming to vibrate against the stone walls. She wasn't stating a fact about the door. She was acknowledging the sudden, suffocating reality of our proximity. Her gaze traveled over me, checking for injuries, but it lingered on my mouth, heavy and unreadable. "Until the gale breaks, you belong to the light." She pushed off the door, the movement abrupt, breaking the spell. "The rotation gear is sticking," she muttered, turning toward the spiral stairs that vanished into the darkness above. "I need to check the lantern before nightfall." "I'll help," I said, the words coming out breathless. She paused, one boot on the first step, and looked back. The shadows cut across her face, highlighting the curve of her cheekbone and the dark intensity of her stare. "It's tight up there," she warned, her voice dropping to a murmur that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Try not to get in my way." She didn't wait for an answer. She started to climb, and I followed, the sound of our boots echoing on the metal like a heartbeat, ascending into the dark. The climb upward felt like ascending into the throat of the storm. The spiral stairs narrowed the higher we went, the iron grating vibrating under our boots with every gust that slammed against the tower. By the time we reached the service deck, the roar of the wind was deafening, a physical pressure that rattled the fillings in my teeth. But then we stepped up into the lantern room itself, and the noise changed. Here, surrounded by walls of thick, reinforced glass, the storm wasn't just a sound, It was a panoramic violence. The ocean was a churning black void below us, exploding into white foam against the glass. Rain lashed the panes like handfuls of gravel. But dominating the center of the room was the lens, a massive, multifaceted jewel of brass and glass, towering above us, dark and silent. "The rotation gear!" Sophia shouted over the gale, her voice tight. She pointed to the heavy clockwork mechanism at the base of the lens. "It's seizing on the north quadrant. If it stops, ships crash. I need to force the pin while you hold the tension lever." She didn't wait for me to agree. She moved into the narrow gap between the lens housing and the outer glass wall. It was a space built for machinery, not people. When I stepped in after her, the world shrank to the size of a closet. "Here," she commanded, grabbing my hand and slamming it onto a cold iron lever waist high. "Lean your weight on this. Do not let it slip." I gripped the cold metal, digging my boots into the grating. Sophia moved behind me, reaching over my shoulder to access the jam in the gears. The proximity was immediate and suffocating. To reach the mechanism, she had to press her body against my back. I felt the solid, heated line of her chest flatten against my shoulder blades, the damp wool of her sweater rasping against my coat. The distance in that small space vanished. "On 3, she growled, her voice right at my ear. I could feel the warmth of her breath ghosting over the sensitive skin of my neck, a stark, humid contrast to the freezing draft coming off the glass. It sent a shiver racing down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. 1, 2, 3. I threw my weight against the lever. It groaned, fighting me. Behind me, Sophia grunted with exertion. I turned my head slightly, unable to help myself, and the sight of her working nearly made me lose my grip. Her sleeves were pushed up to her elbows. Her hands were buried in the brass guts of the machine, wrenching a heavy wrench against a stubborn bolt. I watched the muscles in her forearms coil and release, the tendons shifting under skin that was flushed with blood and heat. A vein in her wrist pulsed violently against the metal casing. Her knuckles were white with strain, the tendons in her wrist snapping taut like wire rigging. I watched the raw power in her grip, the way she forced the unyielding metal to obey her. "It's shifting," she gasped, her forehead pressing against my temple as she leveraged her weight. The smell of her was overwhelming. Hot skin, engine oil, and the sharp electric scent of the storm. I was drowning in it. "Almost," I whispered, my voice wrecking. "Hold it," she hissed. She adjusted her grip, her hand slipping from the wrench to grab the secondary lever, the one right next to mine. She didn't look. She just reached. Her hand landed directly over mine. The contact was like touching a live wire. Her palm was rough, calloused, and scorching hot, enveloping my fingers against the cold iron. I gasped, the sound loud in the sudden stillness between gusts. Sophia froze. She didn't pull away. For a heartbeat, the storm outside ceased to exist. There was only the heavy, crushing weight of her hand covering mine, the friction of her calluses against my knuckles. I could feel the tremor in her fingers, not from the strain of the machine, but from something else. Something volatile. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, she turned her head. Her face was inches from mine. Her pupils were blown so wide her eyes looked black. She wasn't looking at the gears. She wasn't looking at the storm. Her gaze was dropped to my lips, heavy and starving. I felt her body stiffen, a sudden, rigid tension that locked her chest against my back. The heat radiating from her body seemed to spike, baking the air between us. Her thumb moved, just once, dragging a slow, deliberate line across the back of my hand. A test, a question, a claim. "Sophia," I breathed, the name barely a shape in the air. Her eyes snapped up to mine, dark with a hunger that terrified me. Her grip on my hand tightened, bruising and desperate. For a second, I thought she was going to kiss me. I thought she was going to pin me against the brass housing and devour me right there while the ocean tore itself apart outside. Then, clang, the gear released. The tension in the lever vanished. Sophia jerked back as the mechanism groaned to life. The massive lens above us began to rotate, the heavy glass prisms catching the emergency bulb's glow. Sweep. Darkness. Sweep. Darkness. The beam cut through the room, a rhythmic, blinding pulse. It hit Sophia's face in flashes. 1 second, she was in shadow, a dark silhouette of tension. The next, she was illuminated in stark, brilliant white, her chest heaving, her lips parted and wet, her eyes wild and wide. She stared at me, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She looked like she'd just run a marathon or survived a fight. She looked wrecked. "It's fixed," she said, her voice a rough scrape. She didn't move away. She stayed in my personal space, trapped by the rhythm of the light, her gaze dropping to my lips with an undisguised, predatory hunger. "We should go down," she murmured, though she made no move to leave. Her eyes dropped to my mouth one last time, lingering there with a palpable regret. "The heating in the quarters will be on. We can dry off." The way she said it, low, vibrating with subtext, made my knees weak. I nodded, unable to speak, and let her lead me back to the stairs, leaving the light to sweep the empty ocean while the real storm followed us down into the dark. The descent from the lantern room felt like sinking underwater. With every spiral step down the iron staircase, the screaming violence of the gale was muffled by layers of stone and steel, until it became a dull, rhythmic thudding against the walls of the tower. It sounded like a giant heart beating, slow, heavy, and dangerous. We spilled into the living quarters, a small curved room that smelled of old books and kerosene, and the sudden domesticity of it was jarring. A kettle was already whistling on the small gas range, a shrill, demanding shriek that cut through the heavy silence between us. "Get those off," Sophia said. It wasn't a suggestion. Her voice was rough, stripped of the professional veneer she wore at the docks. She didn't look at me. She was already moving, her hands reaching for the hem of her sodden wool sweater. I stood by the door, shivering as the adrenaline from the lantern room began to crash, leaving me shaking and hyper-aware of the freezing water trickling down my spine. I watched, transfixed, as she pulled the heavy knit fabric over her head. The movement was sharp and efficient, but what it revealed was anything but cold. Underneath, she wore a flannel shirt that had been washed 100 times, the fabric worn soft and thin. It was damp from the spray, clinging to her body with a devastating intimacy. The wet cotton mapped the curve of her shoulders, the strong line of her back, and the rise and fall of her chest as she caught her breath. She shook her head, sending droplets of water flying from her dark hair, and turned to face me. Her skin was flushed, a high, feverish color on her cheeks that made her eyes look piercingly bright. "You're shaking," she observed, her gaze dropping to my hands, which were fumbling uselessly with the buttons of my coat. "My fingers are numb," I admitted, my voice trembling. She didn't hesitate. She crossed the small space in 2 strides, invading my personal bubble with a heat that hit me like a physical wave. Her hands brushed mine aside, impatient, capable, warm. She undid the buttons with terrifying speed, her knuckles grazing the skin of my throat, my collarbone, my chest. Every brush of her skin against mine sent a jolt of electricity straight to my core. She stripped the coat off my shoulders and tossed it onto a hook, leaving me standing there in my damp shirt, feeling exposed and incredibly seen. "Sit," she commanded, nodding toward the small table bolted to the floor. "I'll pour." I sat. The room felt too small. The air was thick, charged with the smell of brewing coffee and the scent of drying wool and rain. She placed a steaming mug in front of me, her fingers lingering on the ceramic for a second too long. As she sat opposite me, cradling her own cup, I decided to push. I needed to know. "They warned me about you," I said, wrapping my hands around the heat of the mug. "In town, they said you were ice, that you didn't feel anything." Sophia froze. The steam from her cup curled around her face, obscuring her expression for a second. When she looked up, her eyes were hard. "People in Oak Haven mistake silence for emptiness," she said, her voice low. "They think because I don't smile while I'm hauling 300 pounds of mackerel, that I'm dead inside." "Are you?" I asked, bold. She laughed, a dark, rich sound. "The ocean doesn't care if you're nice. It cares if you're paying attention. If you lose focus for 1 second out there, the water wins. I don't have the luxury of being warm. I have to be the thing that survives." She leaned forward, her elbows on the table. The movement brought her face into the light, and I saw the fire behind the gray of her eyes. It wasn't coldness. It was a fierce, protective intensity. She started talking about the light, not as a machine, but as a pulse. She spoke of nights where the waves broke over the lantern glass, of the responsibility of keeping the dark at bay. I watched her mouth move, the way her lips shaped the words with a passion she kept hidden from the world. It was a fierce, protective intensity that betrayed every rumor in town. And then, with a groan of dying metal, the heating vent in the corner gave a final, rattling shudder and died. The silence that followed was instant and absolute, and the temperature in the room began to plummet. The cold didn't just enter the room, it reclaimed it. With the heating coils dead, the stone walls seemed to inhale the warmth we had generated, sucking it into the masonry until the air turned brittle and sharp. I watched a plume of steam escape my lips as I exhaled, a ghostly testament to how quickly the temperature was plummeting. Sophia cursed, a low, frustrated sound that vibrated in her chest, and kicked the useless vent. "The main generator is diverting everything to the light," she said, her voice tight with annoyance. "If I force the heat, we lose the beacon. We have to conserve what we have." She didn't wait for my input. She moved to a cedar chest at the foot of the narrow bunk, throwing the lid back with a heavy thud. She pulled out a blanket, thick, heavy, gray naval wool that looked like it could stop the wind itself. She didn't hand it to me. She walked back to the small braided rug in front of the emergency coil heater, dropped the blanket, and looked at me. The orange glow of the coils cast long, dancing shadows across her face, making her eyes look bottomless. "Sit," she said, her tone rough. "The floor is the only place we'll catch the heat." I sat. The rug was thin, but the proximity to the heater offered a faint, teasing warmth. Sophia sat next to me. Not near me, next to me. She pulled the heavy wool over our shoulders, creating a cocoon, a tent of privacy in the freezing dark. The world instantly shrank to the 3 inches of space between our bodies. Under the blanket, the reality of our situation became a physical weight. We sat with our knees drawn up, side by side, and, inevitably, gravity and necessity pulled us together. I felt the moment her thigh pressed against mine. It was a shock, a sudden, solid connection that sent a jolt of electricity racing up my spine. The contact wasn't tentative, it was heavy, deliberate. Through the worn denim of my jeans and the soft flannel of her pants, I could feel the dense, powerful muscle of her leg, the heat radiating from her skin like a furnace door had been cracked open. The space beneath the wool heated instantly, becoming a humid, private world. It smelled of her, of rain-soaked wool, of the faint, metallic tang of brass gears, and beneath that, the rich, musky scent of warm skin and cedar. It was intoxicating. I breathed it in, feeling lightheaded, feeling the boundaries of my own body blurring into hers. The storm outside was just a backdrop now, a distant rhythmic thrumming against the stone. But inside our small, heated bubble, the loudest sensation was the frantic hammering of a heart. Hers or mine, I couldn't tell. I could feel the tremor in her arm pressed tight against my side. I could feel the rise and fall of her ribcage where her arm was pressed tight against my side. Every inhale she took pressed her shoulder into mine. Every exhale was a slow, shuddering release that I felt in my own bones. The tension was coiling in my chest, a physical ache that demanded release. I turned my head slowly. She was already looking at me. In the dying orange light, her face was a study in shadows and fire. Her eyes were dark, vast, stripping me down to the nerve endings. The distance between us was non-existent. I could see the pulse jumping frantically in the hollow of her throat. I could count the eyelashes framing those storm-gray eyes. "They're idiots," I whispered. My voice was barely a sound, just a shape formed by breath, intimate and secret. Sophia blinked, her focus dropping to my mouth. "Who?" she murmured, the word vibrating against my skin. "The town," I said, leaning in until my lips were inches from hers, close enough to taste the coffee and salt on her breath. "Everyone who warned me. They said you were cold. They said you were ice." I paused, letting my gaze drift down to her lips, then back up to her wide, darkened eyes. "You're not ice, Sophia. You're burning. You're the hottest thing in this entire ocean." Her pupils dilated, black swallowing the gray in a rush of shock she couldn't suppress. A deep, dark flush rose from her collar, staining her neck, her jaw, her cheeks. She didn't look away. Instead, she moved. Her hand, resting on her knee, slid under the darkness of the blanket. It moved with a terrifying, confident hunger. I felt her fingers graze my hip before her palm flattened against my waist. She didn't just touch me. She claimed me. Her fingers dug in, gripping the fabric of my shirt and the flesh beneath with a possessing, desperate heat. Her thumb pressed hard into my hip bone, anchoring me, pulling me those final millimeters until our hips were locked together. The heat of her hand seared through my clothes, branding me. It was a touch that whispered, "Mine." "You have no idea," she whispered, her voice a wrecked growl. "How long I've been waiting for you to see that." The confession was the spark that finally ignited the fuel between us. Sophia turned fully toward me, the heavy wool blanket slipping unnoticed from her shoulder to pool around her hips. Her eyes were dark, dilated, searching my face with a terrifying intensity that made my heart hammer against my ribs. The confession didn't come in more words. It came in the way her hand moved from my waist, sliding up the sensitive column of my throat to cup my jaw. Her palm was rough, the skin hardened by years of ropes and salt, and the friction of those calluses against my cheek was a shock of pure texture. Her thumb dragged slowly, deliberately over my lower lip, pressing down to test its softness, to feel the tremble I couldn't suppress. She was mapping me. She was claiming the territory she had been eyeing since the dock. Then she closed the distance. The kiss wasn't tentative. It was a collision. It was crushing, devastating, and absolutely starving. It tasted of suppressed longing and the ozone of the storm. The pressure of her mouth was bruising, a desperate, demanding weight that forced my head back against the stone wall. My head fell back, exposing my throat to the rough, desperate slide of her thumbs. There was no hesitation in her now. The Ice Queen the town whispered about didn't exist. There was only this, the suffocating heat of her breath, the wet, desperate sound of our mouths moving together, and the absolute, terrifying focus of her desire. Her other hand tangled into the hair at the nape of my neck, gripping tight, tilting my head to deepen the angle. She kissed me like she was drowning, and I was the only air left in the world. I reached out, my hands finding purchase on her shoulders, digging my fingers into the soft flannel of her shirt. I pulled her closer, wanting to fuse with the heat radiating off her skin. She groaned low in her throat, a vibration I felt against my own mouth, and shifted her weight. She pressed me back, her body a solid, heavy weight pinning me to the spot. Her arm banded around my waist like iron, crushing my chest against hers until I could feel the frantic, hammering rhythm of her heart beating against my own ribs. It felt like a surrender and a victory all at once. For hours, I had watched her control the boat, the lines, the storm, controlling herself. Now, that control was fracturing under the force of her want. I felt the tension in her shoulders give way to a fierce, fluid motion, her body arching into mine, seeking friction, seeking contact. She wasn't the pilot anymore. She was just Sophia, and she was burning. It was a chaotic, beautiful mess of friction and heat. The scrape of her palms against the sensitive skin of my neck, the pounding of blood in my ears, the way she tasted, hot, dark, and overwhelming. We were a tangle of limbs and gasps in the dying orange glow of the heater, the gale outside forgotten, rendered irrelevant by the hurricane she had unleashed inside the lighthouse. She kissed the corner of my mouth, my jaw, the pulse jumping in my throat, devouring every inch of skin she could reach, proving with every touch that the cold had never touched her at all. We broke apart only when our lungs demanded it, leaving us breathless, foreheads resting together, eyes closed, breathing the same heated air in the silence of the tower. Morning arrived with a quiet, gray light filtering through the thick glass, finding us tangled together on the rug, limbs heavy with sleep and peace. There were no words needed over the coffee we shared. Just a silent, knowing look that warmed me more than the sun ever could. The ride back was different. The sea was calm, glass smooth. We didn't speak, but as we steered toward the harbor, Sophia's hand found mine on the wheel, covering my fingers in plain sight. She wasn't hiding anymore. If you want to hear more stories about finding fire in the coldest places, subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next.